Gérance étrangère est de retour en session. The time is 1:20 p.m. Il est 13h20.
Alors, bon après-midi. Bonjour, bienvenue.
Good afternoon. Welcome. So I'm Jean-Philippe Maquin for the Commission. I would like to ask Madame Joly to be sworn in. Madame Joly, could you give your full name and spell your last name for the record? Mélanie Joly, Joly. And now, for the solemn declaration, do you affirm solemnly that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Yes. Thank you very much. Question. First point, Madame Joly, there is simultaneous translation, so this is relevant for both of us. We will try and speak at a reasonable speed. And the first thing that I'd like to do with you is put into evidence two summaries of interviews. WIT 96 is the code of the document. And it's the summary of an interview that took place February 28th, 2024. The first one we had with you. Before your giving your evidence today, you had the opportunity to review this document. Answer, yes. Question, and do you accept that this be filed as evidence for the Commission? Answer, yes. Question, there's an English version, Madam Commissioner, that's also available, a translation of this summary that's also filed as evidence. That's fine. The second document is WIT 148. What we see on the screen is the first page of the summary of the interview we held with you on July 5th, 2024. Same question. You have the opportunity to review this document before your evidence today. Answer, yes. And question, do you accept that this be filed as evidence before the Commission? Answer, yes. Question. First, general question. So I'd like you to describe your journey through the cabinet since you were elected 2025. I was elected in 2025. I was named as Minister of Heritage till 2018 when I became Minister of Tourism, Official Languages and Francophonie until 2019. After the elections, I was appointed Minister of Economic Development and Official Languages, responsible for tourism as well. And in 2021, I was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs. And the elections were in 2021. Answer, yes, October. Question. So, generally speaking, after that we'll speak about foreign interference more. What is your mandate as role of as Minister of Foreign Affairs? Answer, yes. Minister of Foreign Affairs is turned outwards, so always to defend the interests of Canada abroad and also ensure that the Vienna Convention be respected by our diplomats. But I think that Foreign Affairs Canada is quite a large department and one of the few departments, if not the only one, that has a mandate oriented to foreign topics, whereas the majority of departments are interested in national policy. Question, and when you mentioned the Vienna Convention, what are your responsibilities internally in terms of the presence of diplomatic presence of other countries in Canada? Answer, to ensure that Canadian diplomats and also foreign diplomats in Canada conform to the convention. My role is not necessarily surveillance or monitoring, but consequences if there are violation of the Vienna Convention aspects. But I think that before we go on, it would be worthwhile explaining the international context in which I function since I've been appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs. Question. Yes, go ahead. Answer. Yes, that will give the context for the rest of my evidence. I was appointed at the end of October 2021, and within a few weeks, less than a month, the information that I was receiving within my department was that there were 100,000 Russian soldiers at the Ukrainian border, and that there were very high probability that Russia invade Ukraine. So that became the priority, and we concentrated mainly on that issue because the invasion by Russia of Ukraine becomes the greatest threat to international security, which became a reality at the end of February, as we know. And then there followed a huge international security crisis. And since I was appointed, not only was there a war that broke out in Europe between Russia and Ukraine and all its consequences, and also we saw a war break out in Africa, in Sudan, and a war break out in the Middle East, and then Canada had to have 6 evacuations of its citizens, and never seen since the Second World War. And so evacuation in Ukraine, evacuation of Sudan via Kenya, evacuation in Haiti, evacuation also from Israel, from Gaza, and from Jordan, and also from Lebanon. So the Department of Foreign Affairs was in constant crisis management mode, as all departments of foreign affairs in the West at that time. But we had to be able to respect our goals and do this in spite of all these crises. So we were able to file an Indo-Pacific strategy that includes our relationship with China, because when I was appointed, we were pursuing the return of the two Michaels in Canada. It's important to understand that because we had to establish a functional relationship with China, but also we had to reform the Department of Foreign Affairs, which had never been tested so much. So we had to face the new challenges which Canada faced internationally, but also look at how we would manage vis-à-vis states with which we didn't agree. So we developed a new vision of pragmatic diplomacy, and I could refer to that through your questions. And now we're working at a new policy on the Arctic. So Canada finds itself in a context where our foreign policy work is in the context of global insecurity, where Canada, above all, wants to protect our national interests and our sovereignty in Canada. And we do that in various ways. We do it via diplomacy and also in terms of security through parliamentary work, the work of Parliament at the legislative level and of the executive. But we have to be able to discuss with countries with whom we don't agree, with whom we don't hold the same values. And what's the big threat is the shadow of an international conflict. So we have to make sure that we do work of prevention to lead various parties to be able to cooperate on certain aspects. And we're facing very, very great tensions because the international system created after World War II, that was created in order to prevent major conflicts, that whole system is being tested. At the moment, by countries who don't have the same interests as us and don't wish us the best. And it's not only the case for Canada, but for quite a few Western democracy. And that's why this commission is very important, because we're talking about a phenomenon that exists in a wider context. Question. So if we look at the topic of foreign interference in the picture you've just drawn, in what way does your role as Minister of Foreign Affairs interact with the topic of foreign interference? In the case of your mandate, what is the place of foreign interference within that mandate? Answer. It's important. And I have to say that for the first time I've been looking at its importance in concrete terms, in terms of public policy, the Indo-Pacific strategy, which includes our strategy for China. It's the first time that we have dedicated more resources at GAC to approach this question. And what is this Indo-Pacific strategy, just so that we can understand what it is exactly? Answer. Well, it's the first time in decades that Canada has decided to position itself as a credible player, a player who can be trusted as a Pacific nation, because we do have a huge western coast on the Pacific Ocean. And so it's a strategy that involves 17 departments, has a budget of $2.3 billion, and which situates Canada in the Indo-Pacific region, which goes to Asia until India. And at the same time, we include how we will manage the ship. I'd say it's our sandbox, it's our playground. We're establishing how we will engage with China on a diplomatic level. So we're saying, one, we will always be defending our national interests, and two, we will challenge we will be challenging China when we need to, and we will also cooperate with China when we need to. And when I talk about cooperation, we stipulate exactly in what field, and it's especially in climate, environment sector, in terms of everything related to health and prevention of pandemics, and also everything related to nuclear arms non-proliferation. So we can see that our relationship with China is much more limited. So if we take the case of Canada as an example of what happens with other foreign states that might be involved in foreign interference in Canada, is it necessary? Does the necessity of maintaining a good relationship, economic relationship or something, impede our response to foreign interference? Answer. I think there's a false choice between two things. It's maybe my personal opinion, but I think we have to do both. The proof is that I was in charge of expelling Chinese diplomats, and at the same time going on a diplomatic trip to China. We expelled Indian diplomats, and at the same time we continued to have diplomatic relations with India. So we have to be able to do both things, because those are two ways of defending our interests and of having influence at the international level, especially with our allies who are also engaged diplomatically. Question. If we look at what you've done at Foreign Affairs since 2021, can you describe the evolution of the place of the foreign interference file in your daily work? Between 2021 and now, what has been the evolution of the importance of the issue of foreign interference? Answer. It's always been important, but it became more and more important over time because the international security crisis just continues to get bigger. Our states that are not allies pose a problem on the level of the relationships we have them. So we see that we are more concerned about the intimidation of dissidents in Western countries. So it's being spoken about much more. But I have to say that Canada is always the first one to broach the topic at the G7, to raise that issue, even at NATO, which is technically a defense alliance, a military alliance, which, and we'll speak at places like ASEAN, the organization that includes all South Asian countries, and also at the G20, and we also do it on a bilateral level. But I think that there was a crisis in consciousness within our allied countries because we've raised that issue very often. And Canada is a very multicultural society with many different communities, which sometimes include people who have the respect of human rights to heart and who are not afraid, as should be in our society, to speak up, to take the mic and express their points of view. And sometimes the countries they come from are not happy with that. So sometimes, formerly they weren't able to know this, because now with social media and the digital era, they're much more aware of what's happening. So in terms of foreign interference, there is, for me, the foreign interference that's happening in our country, but there's also foreign interference, and especially online disinformation, which is a more recent phenomenon which impacts Canada and many Western democracies, and that's of great concern. And I see that as a different issue. Question will come back to disinformation. You've talked about Canadian society and the fact that there are many communities, many diaspora communities here. Are there perspectives and problems that can affect, or do the problems that can affect these communities have an effect on their orientations in terms of foreign policy? Answer: well, Canada is a defender of human rights throughout the world, and we will be concerned then by the fact that there are violations of human rights abroad. We are a democracy, so that's normal. And at the same time, I would say that's healthy. Question, a more procedural question. In terms of intelligence circulation and how you consume intelligence as a minister, so we understand that there's a list of various mandates. With before you came to Foreign Affairs, did you have access to any intelligence? Answer: no. Question, and now as a minister, in a general way, how are you exposed to intelligence? And after that, can you tell us how that intelligence is of use to you in exercising your functions? Answer: I have a briefing twice a month, generally, about intelligence that we may have gathered or our allies might have collected, especially the Five Eyes, and often before going on a trip, because I am out of the country much of the time. Depending on the destination, I will receive a briefing as well. My team is briefed every week, and I want to say that, how could I say it? In the context of my work, CSIS, or the surveillance agencies, don't report to me. So the intelligence that I receive is from abroad. It's from external sources. So I will receive or about external phenomena. I'll receive intelligence on what's happening in Ukraine, in the Middle East, in Asia, for example. And what I realized is that because of the articles in the media, especially Globe and Mail, it's that everything that was foreign interference in Canada, I could see that I didn't have access to it.
After what we learned from the Globe and Mail at the end of May 2023, I made sure to ask the information from the departments, and that there's a section in our documents that is linked to foreign interference. And after that, I created a position of international security director within my cabinet. Question? I have a question for you. Was it also the case if you had been called to go to one of the countries that Canada sees as a perpetrator of foreign interference? Were you not given the information on the interference activities or attempts to interfere from this foreign country? Response: I didn't go to those particular countries very much. To tell you the truth, except for India, and I got information on the fact that there were concerns with the Indian diplomats. That's why I raised it while I was there. Question? I have a hypothetical question. If some intelligence were to suggest foreign interference activities from foreign diplomats in Canada, do you wait for it to come to your attention or to the attention of your department? Say again? If an intelligence agency finds something that goes against the Vienna Convention, do you expect to get this information? Response: absolutely. I'm not in charge of surveillance. I'm in charge of consequences. So there's diplomatic measures that my department and myself have to undertake, because if there are allegations of FI, we have to react. Question? Another question for procedure, exchange of information. With your departmental colleagues, with the cabinet ministers, with the Prime Minister also. My question is on the duality of foreign interference. There's the international aspect, but there's also the internal aspect right here in Canada, the domestic aspect. Because of the nature, the inherent nature of FI, how do you coordinate? How is coordination done when there's a decision that impacts several departments? How concretely is it done? Response? There's a recommendation that goes all the way up to me. It was the case with Zawe, and I suppose you will have a question for me on that. I expect CSIS and my department to cooperate, and that they agree that there's a consensus and that a recommendation be brought to me. If afterwards I have a recommendation and I'm informed, I will work with the Minister of Public Safety on the issue. But if it stays with the departments and it doesn't come to us, I cannot be informed, so I cannot act. But it's clear for me, foreign interference will never be accepted. So as soon as I get information, I react, and I have a very good toolbox. So there's no reason for me not to use my tools in my toolbox if there are allegations of FI or intelligence on FI. Question. We will come back to your toolbox, but let's talk about coordination between departments. In your interview, you said that in May 2023, you were part of a group of ministers with Minister Blair, Leblanc, Medicino to lead the pan-governmental response to foreign interference. Could you give us the context in which, you talked about it earlier, but the context in which this mission was undertaken and how things occurred? Response, there were a few meetings. I needed to know that there were diplomats that were causing problems. I never got recommendations that there were diplomats that caused problems at that time. And afterwards, there were various things. There was a shuffle and the creation of the commission. And you appeared in my life. Question. So we understand that it wasn't very long, the existence of this group of ministers. Response, no. You said that you had briefings to get a full overview of the situation. Response, yes. Question, of course, we can't talk in detail of what you learned, but in general, the information that you received, were you under the impression that the government information had underestimated the FI threat? Response, no. After that, knowing if CSIS and Global Affairs, if they always agree, sincerely, before reading that in the papers, I had never been informed, and I want to say that I'm not interested in the fights between departments. I expect a consensus, I expect recommendations, because in the end, when there's foreign interference, it has an impact on people. It's not just a lofty concept. There's people's lives or their liberties that are being endangered. That's why it's so important. It's not theoretical in my mind. It's very, very pragmatic. Question. And after these information, this news, this new perspective on foreign interference, was there a change in how your foreign policy was targeted, or was there an impact, or did it continue as is? Response, I think that we reorganized how we consumed and processed intelligence in my office, and above and beyond, it is part of the whole portrait, of the whole scenario. But when I meet with a country like India or China, that's one of the topics, obviously, that I address within a slew of subjects that have an impact on our bilateral relations, but also some topics that are very geopolitical. We will talk about Ukraine, the war, the Mideast conflict, depending on the country. But in short, our meetings are very, very lengthy. Question. You said that for you, foreign interference is clear. It has to be acted upon when there is intelligence on it. There were discussions. Some witnesses talked about the difference between foreign interference and foreign influence or diplomatic efforts. And in your mind, does the distinction become hard to operate with, the gray zone of some activities that are hard to categorize? So in your work, is that something that you were faced with? Is that something that exists, this difficulty to distinguish? Response, I don't think that it's a difference in interpretation. We know the Vienna Convention, but for the general population, it's important to know that influence is to try to, from a country or a proxy, intermediaries, is to try to modify a policy from another state, another country, but openly, transparently. That's what our thousands of diplomats are doing throughout the world. And there's many countries, most countries that are represented diplomatically in Canada, in Ottawa. That's what they're doing every day. That's normal. People try to influence. It's part of diplomacy. That's part of the DNA. Foreign interference is completely different. Foreign interference is the act of a country or its proxies in a malicious, vexatious way and hidden, I would say covertly, by acting covertly, not transparently, to influence, and not just to influence, but to, through intimidation, bullying, people who are part of our democratic system or our society. And that's when the Vienna Convention puts the red line. So Canada does not do foreign interference elsewhere. Question, but is it hard to write that line? Because we've heard many times from many people, namely one of the things that was raised by some is this gray zone. The same thing being done could meet the threshold according to the goal pursued by the person acting in this manner. Response. I'll give you an example. We believe in fundamental rights as a country. We believe in the rights of women, for example. Of course, we will be working with many countries to try to counter the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. And proactively, openly, we will make sure that we're pushing for the issue of women's rights in Afghanistan. We're not hiding it, no problem. There's many things done throughout the world by Canadian diplomats on that, at the UN, in Geneva, in New York, etc. Whereas the problem with authoritarian regimes, authoritarian countries, is that if there's dissidents here in Canada asking for better human rights in their country of origin, we will never accept, we will never do repression outside of our country on people who are talking against Canada. We won't go to the States and say those who are against our government will suffer consequences. No, but there are some states, some countries who will do that in our country. They could do it physically or online. And that's where the Vienna Convention is touchy. It's on the online issue, because the Vienna Convention does not include anything online. It predates that, and that's where it becomes complicated. Otherwise, I think that in the Vienna Convention, there's many tools that we can use to send the message. And after, if we send the message and it's not being heard, which is related to your question, because it's one thing to identify foreign interference, but it's something else to see that it continues, then we have to keep on increasing, how could I say, the diplomatic measures to counter that. And if we see that the diplomatic measures are kept on and there's no change in behavior, there's your response. Do you understand what I'm saying? Question, so you will take other measures, stronger measures? Response, yes, of course, because in the measures, and you'll probably bring me to that, if you put a hierarchy, there's conversations between diplomats, either in Ottawa with the embassies or elsewhere in the world. That's the first, that's the start. I'm not part of those conversations. It's happening every day, probably right now as we speak. After that, there's official measures, because there's a concern and we can see it. So officially, something is being done. After that, I could be told there's an issue, so I will raise it. If the minister raises it with another minister, it comes to another level, and then you could decide, well, you know what? We will be canceling visas. We won't accept some diplomats on our soil. We will also cancel whatever position you want to create in your embassy. After that, we could say we have to have an official meeting with the ambassador. We met with the Russian ambassador at least 10 times on the war against Ukraine, and every time it's very public. We show that the country's behavior is unacceptable, and it can be ramped up all the way to sending back diplomats to their countries, closing embassies, and completely cutting diplomatic ties. So you see there's a gradation. And you have to decide at what level you intervene when there's a certain level of foreign interference. And that's where the decision comes in that I have to make diplomatically, considering also, Madam Commissioner, that every time we do that, there's repercussions. Question? That's also my question. You'll be taking into consideration the way that the other country will be reacting, and everything has to be weighed in the decision that you're taking. Response? There's three possible impacts. Do we have Canadians in that country? Because all at once, they could become, is their safety at risk? Could there be arbitrary detention? Also, is there an economic relationship, so jobs at stake? That also matters. And could our diplomats be in trouble? And is there safety at stake? So at Foreign Affairs, one of the things that I've learned is that we're managing people's safety and also people's lives. There's not a lot of departments in Ottawa that does that, but especially in a context where there's several wars and an international crisis, of course we keep that in mind. Question? We heard one of your civil servants talking about diplomatic measures, saying that there was a scale, a gradation, and there's various types of diplomacy, private, contacts that are not in public or broadcast publicly, and eventually, in increasing measures, it could reach the public eye. So in general, this idea of gradation and the private type of diplomacy and public diplomacy, I suppose that the consequences on the bilateral relationship could have you intervening publicly on some things. Response? Yes. Once we start official measures, I get involved. Certainly, the ambassador is called, summoned, as we say in English. At the beginning of the war, I had summoned the ambassador myself. The beginning of the war in Ukraine, that was the Russian ambassador that had been summoned, and it can go all the way up to PNGs and making those people persona non grata, the diplomats. That's my decision. So I expect people from the department to do their job, and I will do my job when I have to intervene. I will work with the Prime Minister to make sure that he's aware, because he's expecting me to do my job. So when it comes to declaring persona non grata, I will tell him, because it's my responsibility, but he will be informed. And then when embassies have to be closed or renaming ambassadors, because we had severed all diplomatic relations, we will be working together on that. Question? We'll go back to the PNG declaration of Mr. Jaoué later on, but in your toolbox, your ambassadors, Canadian ambassadors, have many things that they can do. They can speak with foreign actors. When you at your level are meeting your counterparts in some countries that cause problems, like China you talked about in a recent visit, at what point do you decide to deal with foreign interference in a bilateral meeting? What will be the thing that makes you decide to intervene with a counterpart? Response: every time I meet with counterparts, especially when there's a more difficult relationship, I have my game plan. I prepare with global affair specialists, and according to the dynamics of the meeting, I keep cards sometimes in my pocket until the last minute, or sometimes I start by bringing them out, but I speak about it in every meeting that I've had. Question. Let's take the example of your latest visit to China. Could we see COM 113, the French version?
And this is a public communique that we obtained at 613. Yes, we're something else. We're looking for COM 613. And I'd like to hear you. The Commission did see documents. It was seen publicly. If we look at assessment of intelligence, there's a certain picture of China that's been presented. And if we looked at this communique, we can go down a bit. So there's something that's quite positive. So the discussed of opportunities, challenges. So discuss the public aspect of the visit to China that we can see here. And if we go to page 2, we can see that you maybe scroll down further. Yes, at the last paragraph, we see you raise the importance of diplomatic relationships which respect the Vienna Conventions on consular and diplomatic relationships. So what does this document reflect of the work that you do on a bilateral level with a partner that can be difficult? Answer, I presented earlier the vision that I presented to Canadians, which basically is to be engaged diplomatically in a pragmatic way. So even when we don't agree on everything, and certainly when we don't hold the same values, we have to be able to speak to each other, because I believe that not being engaged diplomatically often, or most of the time, shows weakness, not strength, because I think diplomacy was invented specifically to prevent conflicts and to have difficult conversations. It's much easier to have diplomatic relationships with a friendly country than with a country with whom we disagree. In the case of the meeting with my counterpart Magny in China, it wasn't the first conversation I'd had with him. I had a call with him in spring 2022. Then we met at the G20 in Indonesia. We had a bilateral discussion. At that point, we also met at ASEAN, and I went to the G20 of the leaders, including the Prime Minister, where I spoke to my counterpart Wang Yi, and the Prime Minister had talks with Xi Jinping. And later, I also met the Wang Yi's successor, Minister Ping Zhang. And then later, when Wang Yi replaced him, I spoke with Wang Yi again, and I saw him at the Munich Security Conference in February. So when I met him in China, I have already had many conversations with him. And I spoke about foreign interference in every one of the meetings I had with him. And so I arrived in Beijing. I prepared myself for hours with the Canadian diplomats in Beijing. And the meeting with Wang Yi was 3.5 hours long. So we met, and then we had dinner, and we talked about many, many topics that are the object of bilateral relationships, including foreign interference, our economic relationships, issues related to fentanyl, for example, and also to health issues, including geopolitics and their support for Russia in Ukraine, going through the Middle East. So it was a very long discussion. Question. So do you think that these personal approaches that you have, we know that that's part of your diplomatic responsibilities for foreign affairs. So what is the what follows? What when you raise the topic of foreign interference? Is there a goal? Answer: yes. The goal is that it cease. Because we don't accept foreign interference, we're exerting pressure on the other country in order to make it cease. And the goal is that that works. Not only that, but also bringing light to what's happening, especially now with the Commission. This helps us to decry an unacceptable behavior. Is it perfect? No, but it's among the best tools we have. And when we do it, you mustn't forget that the other countries, including the G7 countries, don't look at what we're doing. We're the only country in the world that has a commission of inquiry into foreign interference, and that sends a message that in Canada we respect rules. And we want to respect the Vienna Convention. Why? Because Canada is not a nuclear power. We make ourselves respected in the world in the extent to which rules are respected. After World War II, Canada was one of the architects of the new world being created, one rules-based order to prevent conflicts, to solve conflicts. And so in those circumstances, we continue to defend those principles, those rules. And we take many actions, including at the diplomatic level and a commission of inquiry. Question. You talked about disinformation as being a threat that's more and more present and that's new and that keeps changing at the international level. So what is the place of that issue in foreign policy in Canada? Information coming from foreign states. We know, because of the institutional report of your department, that concrete actions have been undertaken through the rapid response mechanism of Canada relating to the Ukraine war. There's Russian disinformation. So what's the place of disinformation? Answer. Disinformation, especially online disinformation, is a gangrene of our democracy. And if we don't put an end to it, our society, our social model is at stake. Because we see that with various technological tools, with the emergence of AI, which really impacts our understanding of the world. Our perception of the world is based on the information we get online. For traditional media, they have a very difficult situation where their business model doesn't function. Many journalists have lost their jobs because newsrooms have closed. So what's happening is that there's a fragility there. Gradually, authoritarian countries who don't wish us well and who don't necessarily believe in democracy are taking advantage of this. What they're doing is that they're finding ways of carrying out disinformation campaigns to influence the population and to create division. That's certainly Russia's goal. And if we look at China, China seeks to act more by going after dissidents. So it's a problem that's of great concern, because how can we make decisions? Well, in democracy, there are facts, and people rely on the facts, and that's how they form their opinions. But if their facts are fake, if we don't have a common understanding of what's happening in our society, well, democracy cannot function. And there's a slippage towards authoritarianism in terms of executive powers, and that's of great concern. That's why the problem that we have with disinformation currently is that the government's capacity to act faced by technological development and the tools that are used, well, it's not obvious that we will be always be able to be ahead of the curve. And there hasn't been enough development of international rules in that topic. So formerly I was a heritage minister of culture and communications, and I was concerned with these issues. And I know that there's not enough accountability by digital platforms who are not doing the work that they should be doing to counter disinformation. That's a huge issue. So what we decided to do is to at least establish a basis for international law. So as a minister, I worked to create a first declaration on the integrity of news online. So we worked with the Netherlands, a country that we get along with very well and believes in international law. That's where the Court of International Law is, in The Hague. And we were able to gather together about 30 countries, so the U.S., European countries, and some democracies in Africa and Latin America who subscribe to those principles. But there are more than 190 countries in the world, so if 30 countries get together to do something, there's still a lot of work to do in terms of establishing international rules. And in Canada, we will be doing to detect disinformation campaigns and to counter them. And that's why there's the work of the RRM that you were talking about. So you talked about your interview, Madame Denard also talked about it last week, that there's a reorientation that seems intentional in terms of surveillance of the Canadian ecosystem in relation to elections. The RRM has this task. Why this intentional change of orientation, not a vocation, but a review of its mission in Canada? Answer, yes, the RRM, well, which in French is the MMR, the Rapid Response Mechanism team, was developed when Canada was at G7 in 2018. And this was created in order to detect disinformation campaigns that were led by states. And the RRM was turned towards what was happening elsewhere. So the disinformation campaigns aimed at Ukraine, for example, campaigns undertaken by Russia. So we were able to detect that. But also we realized that within the federal state, there was no mechanism to detect disinformation campaigns nationally. And that's why the RRM was used several times in an electoral context to see what was going on in our country. But as I said at the beginning of the interview, the Global Affairs Department is oriented towards what's outside of the country. So the goal, and I think that's your, that there is work to be done to see how we could do this in Canada. So it's not necessarily global affairs. Global affairs is concerned with relationships with other countries. Second thing, is the RRM sufficient? Not necessarily. They are people who are looking at trends, but what we need to do now is ensure that there's more accountability from digital platforms on these issues, because they do have responsibilities. They have a responsibility in Canada, and also in the U.S., that they have to assume. And there's a politicization of digital platforms that's also happening when there are owners of digital platforms that take a position in the U.S. elections. That's a problem. And also what we're seeing now is that we have to find technological means to address this issue. It can't just be people, because the tools being used by foreign states, for example, in English, I'd say the bots that amplify campaigns, it's not something that's handcrafted. It's created by technological tools. So in Canada, we have to be able to take technological measures, or have the technological measures. I'm not an expert, but I'm convinced there are people who can find solutions to that. And that expertise does not lie within Global Affairs Canada. Question. Ms. Atenau is saying that despite this vocation that needs to change, the reorientation for RRM in terms of elections, that the RRM has an important role to play in the work of the site task force as concerns federal elections. Can you explain to us what that role would be? What is the importance of having Global Affairs Canada and the RRM maintaining its participation within the site task force? Answer. Well, I'm not involved in the issue of supervision of elections, but it's only because the RRM is the only solution we have that they are participating in site, the surveillance of elections. So then one should wonder, well, what other department could take care of this issue? Do we need another RRM somewhere else, or it's a question which must be solved. The Commission should look at this, and I'm very ready to listen to your recommendations, because in 2018 we had a good idea at Global Affairs in 2018, and that became a tool that was important, that could help us at a global level. We were able to work with other states on the fact that we could identify phenomena online, but now we've realized that it's something that's essential in Canada. So I think we could move to the next step. And the problem that this creates, because you're not the first to tell us that it's not the mission of Global Affairs, is it essentially a problem of resources, or does it go beyond an issue of resources? Answer, yes, it's beyond resources. I think that in the 2022 or 2023 budget, the department got more funds for the RRM, but I think this mechanism, or those mechanisms, must work within a department that's concerned with internal affairs. Question. And have you identified a department or more departments that this experience acquired by the MMR, the RRMs, could be easily transferred? So now I'll answer. I'm speaking about opinions, not facts. But in any war or any conflict, there is a communications department. In some autocratic countries, it's a department of propaganda. Canada, at the time, created a communications department in the Second World War, and that department became the CRTC, and various laws were created, and that was all amalgamated under a Canadian heritage. But Canadian heritage deals with cultural issues, funding of arts and culture, but there's a whole element related to communications. The CRTC has in an analog world, is a position that cancelled the operating license of RT, Russia Today, which was being broadcast. Now, can the CRTC face a Russia Today campaign or identify it? I don't think that it would have the resources to do so. But in the normal mandate of Heritage Canada, could we not think that maybe there's work that's been done through work to identify disinformation campaigns by foreign states? Possibly.
So there's that, but there's also public security, national security. So there is a solution somewhere, but if I look at the United States, for example, or Great Britain, within the State Department in the United States, there is a team looking at information issues. But same thing, like in Canada, linked to disinformation throughout the planet, and not necessarily just in the States. Question, you spoke about Russia and Russia Today. But with the RRM, we understand that the issue of ecosystem surveillance or observation of our domestic ecosystem could be moved somewhere else. It could be not under that mechanism, but for surveilling trends towards other countries, this mission will always come back. And on disinformation, on Canada or in Canada, under the guise of foreign interference, we're using the RRM that would keep looking at international trends. And now the question is, what is the link with our domestic surveillance? Response, let's give you the example of Russia Today. I made a declaration of what they're doing here in Canada. We identified that Russia Today had been banned. The license had been removed by the CRTC. What they did is to continue their propaganda because it's a propaganda agency, and Russia Today's goal in the West is to divide democracies. I've spoken about it in a testimony because Russia Today is Russia. What they did is that they recruited commentators, influencers in Canada who were online, extreme right commentators, to create division. They paid them. They also created false independent media in Canada, fake independent media for which these commentators were working, and thereafter they could be quoted by traditional media and other political commentators generally. And Russia Today, in the meanwhile, is making money. So it's paying for war efforts in Russia against Ukraine. And moreover, Russia Today and Russia are targeting directly digital infrastructure in Canada. So we detected that, and we worked with the Five Eyes on that issue. But the reality is that it's happening here. It's a direct threat to our democracy. That's why we identified it through the RRM. I made a public declaration, a public statement, so that Canadians be made aware. There were lawsuits in the States against them also. So there's this whole phenomena of foreign interference, but also which is online disinformation. So that's why you said FI and online disinformation are different, but they're the same, because it's not the Vienna Convention that can help us deal with online disinformation. Question, so disinformation is a manifestation of foreign interference. It's one of the symptoms. Response, yes. Question, so we understand that there was a public statement on Russia today. We understand that it's just not disinformation. It's a public statement of disinformation. In the interviews that we had with you and with the civil servants, we spoke about the spam campaign, the campaign against Mr. Chung. So I won't go back on these events in detail, but for public dissemination of disinformation events, there's not a framework that allows states to be denounced or attributed disinformation actions. Madame Denham spoke about the public attribution framework when there's a statement by the government. So what is your personal role as a minister? What is the power granted to you? What is the responsibility that you hold in this protocol or this public framework? Well, for cyber incidents, there are international rules that have to be complied with. But it has to take into consideration the technological reality and the particular vulnerabilities that could still be present in a system that was just the victim of a cyber attack. So we keep that into consideration when we decide to point fingers. And we've seen that other countries were victims of cyber attacks and that they attributed the act to somebody. And even if we didn't do it, we still educate the public to the effect that there are threats, digital cyber threats against Canadian infrastructures. And that's why I made a statement to support the accusation made from Great Britain on the People's Republic of China in one of the incidents that they suffered. Question, so for cyber attribution, there's a protocol on some types of events that reach a certain level of impact. And the final issue is that there's a public attribution, a public blaming of who committed the cyber attack. So there's conditions, there's various partners that are involved, government partners. When the conditions are not met to publicly attribute a cyber attack, the tools, the other diplomatic tools, can they be used? Response, yes, of course. If there's no attribution, there could be a summons of the ambassador, or there could be diplomatic measures or refusal of visas, etc. Yes. Question, in the institutional report from your department, it says that there were no activations of the public attribution framework for cyber attacks on democratic processes. So do you confirm that it's the case? Response, yes. Question, I will ask you to take the summary of interview WIT 148 on the screen, please. Go to paragraph 16, please. There are details that are not in the document for national security reasons. And under 16, you see that you were made aware of cyber threats against Canada and that you decided that it was not desirable to make a public attribution of some activities, and it would go against Canada's interests. So, response, every time, the only question that we ask ourselves as departments is it in our own interests in the current situation, based on the situation, the state of the information system, the infrastructures, and essentially the need to attribute the cyber threat or not. Question. With the cyber threats against Canada, you've authorized through a memorandum that your deputy minister would take diplomatic measures to signal that those activities were unacceptable. Response, yes. And question, after that, you authorized that a statement be published with some of your counterparts, ministers. So let's look at 473 in French, please. It dates back to June 3rd, 2024. It's a public statement. And in this communique, with your two colleagues, it says that Canada has been targeted by cyber malfeasance, and some states are named. If you go down, some foreign states like the People's Republic of China, North Korea, Russia, Iran, trying to target computer systems in the private and public sector, and then it's the PRC that is the origin of most cyber attacks or cyber threats against Canada. So that's not a cyber attribution, formally. Response, no. That's a declaration, a statement to raise people's awareness. We know that there are threats. We inform people that there are threats, but we're not naming particular incidents. Question, if there's a diplomatic goal for those states that are named here, that they be told indirectly that their activities are seen and detected by Canada. Response, well, by saying it publicly, it has an impact on the diplomatic relationship. And there's states and countries that we don't have a relationship with, like North Korea and Iran. So even if we don't have a diplomatic relationship with those states, we still have to be careful. Question, we can go back to WIT 148, where we deal with the situation with the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, paragraph 17. And here in August 2023, the United Kingdom asked for Canada's support, and it was more concrete in March 2024. So tell us what happened. We see it in public attributions that there are international efforts when it's your department asking to make a public attribution, getting support elsewhere. So how significant is it for cyber attributions and more generally, diplomatically, to get support from allies of Canada? Response, the United Kingdom will ask for support from Canada and also the Five Eyes, Australia, New Zealand, the States, as us. And it's also important for us to do it if there's a cyber incident, because that way we're not isolated diplomatically. So the more you're isolated, the impacts are stronger diplomatically. That's why the fact of being in a coalition helps us to mitigate our risks. Question? We could leave the document there. When you talk about the declaration of persona non grata of Zhao Wei, your civil servants spoke about how it happens and how it occurs. Please tell us how this person was declared PNG and describe your personal involvement and what were the things that were considered. Response? At that time, there were concerns with the Chinese police stations. There were RCMP investigations, and at the same time we were managing the Chinese balloons on top of our territory and the American territory. And I was having conversation with Tony Blinken, the Foreign Secretary, at that time. So when the Globe and Mail article is published in May, it's all part of the concerns that we're having with what China is doing. And you see that there's unacceptable, unconscionable behavior happening from one diplomat, Zhao Wei. So I read the Globe and Mail, the article, and I was not aware of Zhao Wei in particular. That's why I asked for a recommendation. So for me, it's obvious that the situation is unbearable, and he has to leave, absolutely. So that's why the question that I'm asking at that time is how, well, it's already been decided that he has to leave. How do we manage the impacts diplomatically? And I said earlier, Madam Commissioner, the diplomatic repercussions, the impacts are Canadians in danger in China? Will there be job losses in Canada because there will be economic sanctions? And also, are there Canadian diplomats in China that could be in danger? So after looking at all these issues, I made the decision to declare Zhao Wei persona non grata, and after that, as we've seen, when you make a decision, there was a decision, a reaction was to declare Jennifer Lalonde, who was our consulate in Geneva at that time. Question, you said that the decision was made. You said it's after reading the Globe and Mail that it was obvious at that point that response, yes, that was the recommendation that is made to me to declare him PNG. Question, during his testimony, your deputy minister, Mr. Morrison, refused the suggestion that we were making that if there hadn't been the Globe and Mail article, Zhao Wei would not have been kicked out on May 8th. And Mr. Morrison said that it was already in the cards to consider sending him back, whether it's Zhao Wei or somebody else, but that the Globe and Mail article and the name with the allegation of foreign interference accelerated the decision-making process. In your decision-making process and what you considered in your mind, this publication, that it's in the public space, that there's the name with foreign interference accusations, what would have been the impact if you're saying that it was clear that the decision was made and a recommendation was made to you, but personally, in those circumstances, what was the impact of this public-facing article? Response, well, I see that there is information linked to Canadian diplomats in Canada, and I hadn't been informed. So that's why it highlights that we have to change our system on how information is transmitted and consumed. So that's why we created the International Security Officer position in my office, and we asked that the department, in its intelligence reports, to include something on foreign interference, because as you know, CSIS is not under my direction. So there's, I maybe would say, a gap in the transfer of information. So with Zhao Wei in itself, like I said, the situation was unbearable because there were already challenges linked to how Chinese diplomats were behaving, namely with the police stations. And those police stations are clearly foreign interference because they don't comply with the Vienna Convention. because it's not declared diplomats with diplomatic visas, and then our territorial safety, the Canadian balloons that were floating over our territory. So declaring him persona non grata, normally when you declare somebody PNG, normally you choose, and I said it earlier, the type of person. Sometimes it could be, normally it could, it's a position. It doesn't target a particular person, a particular diplomat, but we had information that said it was this person in particular rather than his position. If you give me the example of India, when there are credible allegations that there were agents from the Indian government that murdered somebody here in Canada, Mr. Nijar, a citizen, we targeted a position, a liaison agent, who, from their service, their intelligence service.
But for Zawe, we're targeting one person. I have a question. You talked about two changes to the creation of a director's post in your cabinet, and also one at CSIS to have a section. So those changes were already implemented? Answer, yes. Question, and when would that have been done? Answer, for the way in which intelligence reaches us in the following weeks, because we realized that there is a problem. The political levels have to be made aware of what's happening between the agencies. Question, and the director's post was filled when? Answer, well, we already had someone who was in charge of all these cases, and we added to their functions the position of a director of national security. And until now, have these changes been productive? Answer, yes, very much. So, because with the minister, we have a lot of issues to be addressed. We're almost always in a situation of crisis. And if there's not someone in our team who's not following what's going on in terms of intelligence and foreign interference, well, honestly, there's so many crises every day that we can't act in a proactive way. And the issue of foreign interference, we can't always manage it, and becomes a crisis in the media, so we have to address it proactively. So we have, as soon as we see that there's something that can be difficult, we have to address it. My responsibility is to protect Canadians. It's not to manage media pressure. My priority is that people feel safe and that they can use their right to freedom of expression within the country, and that people who want to go into politics don't feel intimidated because there are foreign diplomats exerting pressure on them. That's totally unacceptable. That's why. Question. Could you please put up CAN Sum 16, which is a thematic summary on the declaration of persona non grata for Mr. Jaoué. So you already spoke about the main issues. So paragraph 5 of this document, we can see that it's in English. The French version will be sent to us soon. That there are a number of documents from CSIS referring to the interest that China might have concerning MP Michael Chong, which were produced and sent to GAC before May 2021. We know that you were elected later, or appointed later in 2021. And when were you made aware of the intelligence mentioned here that we can't discuss the nature of here, but when were you made aware of this? Answer, I wasn't informed of anything related to Jaoué until there was a publication in... actually, I'm talking about Mr. Chong here. Answer, so of this specific situation of intelligence that would have been sent before May 2021 on concerning Michael Chong, were you informed about that at some point in 2023 or whenever? Answer, no. I read in the press that there had been attempts, that there had been foreign interference against Michael Chong much later. So the only time we discovered something related to Michael Chong was when there was a disinformation campaign launched against him. And then we decided to put a whole process in place to, first of all, make sure there was a report. Secondly, that Michael be informed. Third, that we summon the ambassador. And then that the report be made public, that the public be aware that Michael was the victim of a disinformation campaign against him. And after that, the department contacts May 10 Cents, the company which owns WeChat, so that disinformation be removed. But we know that up till now, Tencent has not done anything. Question. It was mentioned that in the decision for declaring Mr. Jaoué as persona non grata, whether there was a link to Mr. Chong, and the answer was that Mr. Jaoué did not engage in foreign interference activities towards Michael Chong. Answer, I think that Jaoué had been exhibiting problematic behavior and was not respecting the Vienna Convention. We had information to that effect, and so that we needed to act. And that's why when the department came and gave me the recommendation of declaring him persona non grata, I approved it. Question. And following the expulsion of Mr. Jaoué, there were changes made to the organization in terms of consuming intelligence in your cabinet. And so at that point, there was a group of ministers that was created to lead the response. And we understand that's in the wake of these events that this group was constituted for a very brief period of time, as you said. Answer, yes. And at the time, but you haven't referred to this yet, I know, but when we met together as a group of ministers, and the Privy Council a clerk is there too. I was asking if there were other diplomats in the country who are problematic. I wanted to know, because I'm not afraid of sending someone home if they're problematic. And at the time, you're saying from May until now? No, currently, there are no diplomats in that situation. Question. Earlier, you alluded to the situation related to Mr. Nijar's murder and the consequences on the diplomatic relationship with Canada was declared by the Deputy Minister, but simply in the wake of this event and in relation to other activities related to India, the evolution of this relationship has been what? Where are we now? So, answer, there is the RCMP investigation that led to arrests. Question is on diplomatic relationships. Answer, it's a tense diplomatic relationship. I can't state it more forthrightly. It was a huge violation of Canadian security, and there's a huge concern related to the security of Canadians. That's there are credible allegations. I repeat what I said earlier, stating that there would have been agents from India that were involved in the murder of a Canadian on Canadian soil. So when I was informed of this in the summer of 2023, very quickly what I did is to determine what the principles governing our diplomatic relationship would be. One is seeking truth, and that's what happened. Secondly, protecting Canadians. If it happened to one person, that should not happen to anyone else. And third one, to protect Canada's sovereignty in a diplomatic sense. And that's why I contacted my counterpart, my Indian counterpart, and I asked him India's cooperation to shed light on the matter, to respond to our security concerns. And then the Prime Minister met with Prime Minister Modi in India during the G20, and then the Prime Minister made a public statement. And after that, I worked with several countries to inform them about what had happened. And the best example of a decision that wasn't rational and had huge consequences, and which is counterproductive, is India's decision to expel 41 of our diplomats, which is a reaction that goes against the Vienna Convention, because what we did is that the Prime Minister made his statement in the House of Commons, and then I announced that, as I said earlier, that the person who occupies the liaison officer of ROC, of the intelligence organization in Canada, is declared persona non grata. India replies a few weeks later, in spite of several conversations I had, in spite of my discussions with several countries, India reacts by expelling 41 diplomats. And still now, that is totally unacceptable. But we continue to have diplomatic relationships in spite of everything, because it's important to have one, but we have continued to ask for their cooperation and to ensure that there was accountability for this crime. Thank you, Madame Joly. Madam Commissioner, those are my questions. Thank you very much. We'll take a 20-minute break.